Hi, my name is Stu Bailey, and I'm the co-founder and chief enterprise AI architect at ModelOp. ModelOp provides a best-in-class enterprise model production solution called ModelOp Center. For the past 5 years, we've been focused on the large enterprise, often highly regulated industries. Specifically, ModelOp Center addresses the wide variety of problems around the operationalization of AI and ML models as they impact existing business and technical processes. For example, in the areas of compliance and risk management, which we'll be talking about today, as well as technical processes such as SecOps, ITOps, and DevOps, and importantly, modeling processes such as data science. I welcome everyone to our Fireside chat with Shrikant Dash, titled Model Risk Management Programs in the Age of AI. With that, let me hand it over to today's guest, Shrikant Dash, to introduce himself. Shrikant?
Hey, Stu. Thanks for having me on. This is an important area of discussion, so happy to answer any questions. Just to introduce myself, I'm Shrikant Dash. I was most recently head of analytics and information management at Citigroup and have worked at General Electric and Morgan Stanley and Discover Financial Services, leading consumer lending, risk, marketing, but also large analytic teams over the last 25 years or so.
That's great, Shrikant. It's so great to be able to talk with you as always. So again, for our audience, today's topic is model risk management programs in the age of AI. And what I thought would be great is I just have a few questions to ask you over the next 30 minutes or so. And I think your perspective is really what people want to hear about. So with that, let me just jump right in. At ModelOp, we find that in many industry verticals, model risk management and governance are the most important issues to be addressed with respect to model production. Is that how you think about it? And maybe you could help us understand the organizational context for model risk management.
Stu, that's a great question. I think, well, fundamentally, in every industry vertical, but particularly in those where there's a large regulatory overhang, you want the business concern to focus on having models, strategies, and other production analytics to achieve the business outcomes you want, which is growth, customer experience, profitability. In order for us to do that, we have to make sure we have the right checks and balances, the right controls in the production environment, and the right organizational structure to effectively manage those checks and balances against those controls. And the way you do that is by saying, first of all, how do we put things in production? How do we measure the things that we produce? And how do we make sure that there's an organizational structure divided into first line, second line, and third lines of control so that there are effective checks and balances? I think if you do those three things, then I would say that we would have the right kind of balance in terms of how we achieve model production solutions. And I think the office of the chief model risk officer within corporate risk is just a focal point to establish ownership around that organizational structure.
I think, I mean, you really bring up several points there, Shrikant, which I think are generally, in our experience, not initially recognized when thinking about the impact of AI and ML models. I mean, such an exciting technology. There's so much going on in data science, but you're really bringing up how it's the impact on these existing business processes, right? That these models are actually focused on those decisioning processes that drive the top line, the P&L, and that really, you know, is often not a focus when thinking about the production of models. Oh, hey, we have to do all these things technically to get these, you know, algorithms to work. Some of them are data intensive algorithms. Some are, you know, small data algorithms. But the machine learning is very complicated and sophisticated. But it's really the impact on things like model risk management, which have been, you know, a mainstay for keeping the organization in line with the in compliance with respect to business success and the P&L. And I just think that's so important. I mean, what would you say are the critical factors from a model risk management perspective that make for a leading enterprise class model production solution?
So I would preface the answer to this, Stu, you made a very important point, which is you can't get the full value of the predictive accuracy and the predictive lift of your new generation AI models unless you have a way of making sure that they are in a controlled environment. They are actually performing as intended. This is a very important issue. So unless you manage the logistics of your model production, you're not going to get the business value of those models, right? Having said that, what are some of the critical factors, right? So one, having a comprehensive tiered model inventory by typology with defined owners and defined users is very important at a minimum. So essentially, you know what's the total number of models in production, for example. And then, of course, documentation, validation and tracking, deterioration of models and deterioration diagnostics for models, as well as the governance of models in terms of techniques, stability, explainability, bias, macroeconomic factors. And now with COVID, cyclical or stochastic stress is very, very important in model production. So these are all the important issues surrounding model production to make sure that you have things under control and everything is performing as intended.
Yeah, that's great. And as you've pointed out, I think, and what our experience has been is that model risk management becomes kind of a focal point for understanding how these ML and AI technologies are going to integrate into the decisioning systems, and that it's an enterprise-wide focal point. Compliance is not, just something that happens within a business unit or in a particular type of P&L context. It's really a firm-wide concern with respect to governance and accountability and responsibility. And so, that's really challenging. I mean, this is maybe, model risk management systems have been in place for, decades or more. And there's really the AI and ML models are new classes of models. So there's a unprecedented mixing of technical complexity and challenge with existing systems for enterprise-wide governance. And so from a model risk management perspective, I mean, how does one address and balance the business requirements, as you mentioned, such as speed to market, predictive accuracy, innovation, and then technical requirements such as platform efficiencies, control, and scale with regulatory requirements around model governance?
So again, great question. Let me provide some historical context. So with financial institutions, in particular, consumer financial businesses, modeling and use of models and strategies in business decision-making has been going on for the last few decades, but with a limited set of statistical and mathematical techniques, which have expanded more recently. But another important sort of issue that has emerged since the Great Depression or Great Recession, I should say, of 2008, 2009, is that's when, as a result of Dodd-Frank and greater regulatory governance around bank holding companies and stress testing of bank holding companies to make sure that they were not going to negatively affect the overall financial system, a number of different strictures were put in place. And one example is the core regulatory rules around model governance, which is SR 11.7 and its successive amendments. So the point here is that in order to make sure that we have great analytics, great models, you have to make sure that there is, for example, peer review, there is documentation, that when you introduce new modeling techniques, that it's transparent to both the regulators as well as internal constituents as to how it affects business decision making. So you can't just introduce a black box model and ensure that it does not have bias, for example, in regard to fair lending questions. That's a very simple example. So, or for example, if you're introducing new classes of fraud models, you want to make sure that those fraud models catch the criminals but don't affect redlining, for example. So all these issues in one way affect business outcomes in a positive way, but then we have to make sure that they're compliant and they're doing the right thing for the customer base and from a sustained profitability perspective. And central to this question is really having a production environment. So from 2008, 2009, there have been attempts, I think, to create production solutions, platforms. But I think till recently, when companies like Models Ops have come into the picture to provide these kinds of solutions, we really haven't taken this as seriously as we should. And I think one of the reasons why there is a lot of attention right now on creating sort of a model operation solution or model operation environment is because of the proliferation of AI and ML techniques. You also have a proliferation of the underlying data. A lot of that data may not be in the right format, may not be clean to the extent that we want from a regulatory perspective. So you want to make sure that you have nice, clean data, and you have explainable AI and ML models. And so therefore, I think having model production environments is more urgent today than it was, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago, when there was a proliferation of governance and capital reserving models, but not necessarily a proliferation of techniques, which has happened more recently.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Shrikant. I mean, that's really, as we've delivered Model Ops Center to the market, especially the highly regulated market, as a enterprise class model production solution, we've really known the leading features that have been driven into Model Ops Center that both creates differentiation for us, but really is solving the real pain in our customer base, is this kind of tight integration with very complex, as you mentioned, like very complex models in terms of their relationship to technology and data, right? And this kind of a need for the existing model risk management systems to be able to handle the outcomes of that gracefully, but also now provide feedback at a pace that is being driven by the AI and ML. The pacing of the process is now driven more from the technical pacing and less from just the business, the standard business pacing. So you might have to get regulatory reports out at a much higher pace than ever before because models might be retrained. And so it's exactly what you said, whether they are in compliance with respect to bias or redlining, now that process might have to be run on a daily basis, where previously maybe a model would have only been refreshed on a weekly or monthly, or even semi-annual basis. And so, being able to tighten all that together in an automated framework, and I think automation is another key for acceleration of the impact of AI and ML into existing governance and compliance processes in large organizations. It's really critical for there to be some ability to see exactly how these models as first-class assets fit into all of these existing processes and how that can be tightly automated so the whole thing can be accelerated over time. And again, that's a journey. What we found in our customers is that like, oh, hey, you just put in this whiz-bang thing and the next thing you know, you can, be 10 times faster on how to get through compliance reporting processes or stress testing, for example. But investing in kind of a platform that allows for that integrated business and technology automation really is allowing organizations to make significant progress in allowing the ML and AI technologies to have a dramatic impact on their performance in their industry. So I really just couldn't agree with you more. And that kind of frames things. I mean, it's not just about these things. In many ways, existing model risk management programs face several emerging issues, right? A, as we've been talking about, new AI and ML modeling techniques. B, as you brought up, kind of questions about explainability and ethical bias. I mean, how do we think about that in relation to some of these data-driven and very automated algorithms? But also, there are new classes of regulatory, capital, and behavioral models. I mean, think about like the current expected credit losses, the CECL type models. I mean, can you provide a view on how these issues can be addressed in a production solution for models?
Yeah, so I think a number of issues have been emerging, as you point out, Stu. For example, there is more data, as I said, and there's obviously a proliferation of techniques. But as you're aware, There's also a number of companies in the fintech sector, for example, a lot of startups that are providing open source DevOps platforms. So you have a number of companies that are saying, here's a bunch of open source model libraries, for example. How can that be integrated into a production environment is a very critical factor. The fact that there's democratization of both data and analytic tools and techniques in a platform-oriented structure means that the ecosystem is more complex. So there are a number of these kinds of things. The other thing that we often don't think about is digitization. So, the fact that both customers are sort of using digital channels much more, and now with COVID, it's sort of accelerated, means that from a technology perspective, things are moving from a batch-oriented analog world to a much more real-time digital world where people, don't have that much time. So you have to sort of think about much more rapid cycles because of digitization. You have to think of the complexity of the ecosystem because, as I said, of the new sort of analytic development platforms that are being provided. You have a proliferation of data that allows you to use much more data to build much better classes of models. And then you also have this issue of how to deal with stochastic shocks. COVID is just an example. I mean, you've got this year, the number of hurricanes, I was just reading that they're running out of names for hurricanes because there are so many of them. Each of those things have an impact on how we think about model production and accuracy. So the environment, I think, if you had to summarize it, is becoming more complex and has a proliferation of tools in it. And so it's important, I think, in a production environment to make sure that, one, you architect it and engineer it in such a way that it is able to scale based on the larger amounts of data, that it is agnostic to particular types of tools and ecosystems, so they can really take as inputs a variety of different analytic techniques, but then preserve the core tenets that we've been talking about in the last 20 minutes or so, which is, hey, we want to make sure that we have the right controls. We want to make sure that we have the right checks and balances. We want to make sure that we have the right documentation, that we have inventory, and we have the ability to, in that inventory, define ownership for model production, model usage, and most importantly, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that this production environment is something that produces the right business outcomes and the right customer experience for a company. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, it's really striking, actually. From our experience, how the AI and ML technologies have driven exactly what you said, like platform and scale initiatives around data ops, for example. Very specific modeling efforts with, exploratory data analysis and sophisticated mapping of algorithms to specific business problems, all the data science stuff in the business units itself. But of course, there are a number of technical challenges of getting models kind of deployed into infrastructure. But really, the model risk management function provides, the only analog, if you will, of an existing process that is enterprise-wide, has the visibility into all the business accountability functions, really must understand both what is the value of models to the business and business units, as well as what is the risk of models to the overall organization and mission. I mean, it's really a unique opportunity for leaders in the model risk management to have a dramatic impact on how enterprise AI initiatives can be accelerated and more impactful in a large enterprise. I mean, as a model risk management leader for your career, almost all of your career, Shrikant, I mean, how should other model risk management leaders and practitioners think about automation and this evolving technology and production standards in model governance as an ongoing business process?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, any solution just provides a framework within which you can operate in the way that we've been talking about so far. And model ops is an example. Model ops is definitively architected to provide an enterprise scale solution for model production. And we've been talking about how that's a central concern and the central role of the model risk management function within financial institutions and other regulated industries. So I think the point is to embrace that technology, but not to assume that the technology, I think you sort of said this earlier in the conversation, is some kind of magic bullet where you purchase a solution and suddenly tomorrow everything is going to sort of work magically. I think you have to embrace the technology in a knowing fashion. So a couple of things that are required. One, I think it's very important for the risk leaders in the organization to be commercially savvy and to be technologically savvy, to really understand how DevOps as well as model ops and ML ops broadly is evolving. I think it's very important that we all sort of keep up with how this is evolving. Second thing, I think this requires significant collaboration between first-line business unit managers, program managers, as well as data scientists in the business lines, the finance function for all the regulatory and capital reserve type models, as well as risk and technology. All of these functions have to come together and understand that in order to have this kind of controlled enterprise level oversight and governance in modeling, that you have to understand what technology does for you and how that technology architecture allows you to achieve the business outcomes that you want. So really, that's what it's all about, is for people to sort of embrace it, but with their eyes wide open and to understand the evolution of all this.
That's great, Shrikant. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think that your perspective on model risk management programs in the age of AI is on point, and I think it should be very valuable to other model and risk professionals in regulated industries, as well as all kind of executives overseeing the impact of enterprise AI initiatives on existing large industries. So thanks so much for spending some time with us today, Shrikant. I think your insights are not only, as I said, on point, but I think prescient and valuable. So really appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Thanks, Stu. I think it's important to present sort of an industry point of view in all this. I think hopefully it's helpful as you think about next generation of production solutions at an enterprise level. But what I'm saying effectively is what many executives tasked with model oversight and governance are thinking about in their daily work. So hopefully this is a useful starting point for further conversations.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, a starting point for the journey. So thanks again.
Thanks.